Hello and welcome to the SLW Institute webinar, Techniques and Analytics for Identifying Valuable Patents and Patents to Abandon. This is the first episode of an 8-part series about patent analytics. More information about this series is available on the Schwagman website. Please enter any questions using the Q&A feature in the menu. Our moderator today is Steve Lundberg, and he'll introduce our speakers. I'll hand this over to Steve.
Thank you, Michelle, and welcome everybody to the webinar. I hope everyone is safe and sound. I assume everyone's pretty much listening in from home today. Our panel today is a group of highly experienced attorneys who have done a tremendous amount of this type of work on the topic we're discussing today. We start with Janelle Callis, who's been a principal at Schwagman for many, many years. Janelle is a chemical background. She's got a chemical engineering degree from University of Minnesota. And Janelle has done a lot of portfolio management for large consumer product companies in the chemical art area. So she brings a good perspective from the chemical art domain. Our next panelist today is Tom Marlowe, who actually was a Schwagman attorney at one time, and after that he went on to become the Chief Patent Counsel at Fairchild Semiconductor, and Tom is currently now the president at Renewals at Black Hills IP, and Tom has also done a lot of portfolio management in the semiconductor area when he was at Fairchild, and continues to do analytics work for Black Hills customers. Tyler Nasidlak also has a tremendous amount of experience, both in private practice and in corporate practice. And you can see from the slide there that Tyler was former Chief Patent Counsel of Guidant Corporation, Boston Scientific, and their CRM area. And Tyler also, of course, has been involved in portfolio management and pruning. And Mark Stignani, last but not least, also a former Chief Patent Counsel at Thomson. And Mark is our analytics chair at the firm and our compliance officer. Mark has done a lot of work for our customers in analytics and portfolio management. So we got a great panel. So if we go to our next slide, I'm just going to cover a couple of quick overview slides. I think a lot of this is pretty self-evident, and but most folks that go through large portfolios quickly realize that only a relatively small number of the patents in a portfolio typically are very high value, usually maybe 20%, sometimes as little as 5%. Are very high value patents. This is not to say that there's many exceptions to all these rules. So you may have a portfolio that has 10 patents and all 10 could be extremely valuable. You might have 1,000 patents and you might only have a few that are really high value, but they may have a lot of other values in between depending on your circumstances. So I think one thing that we'll learn today is there is no one size fits all for this analysis that we're going to talk about. So why are patents so disparate in value? Well, every patent filing is essentially a very speculative thing. And that value is, when it's initially filed, is completely dependent on what happens with the technology that it covers. If that technology goes nowhere, the patent has no value. It's dependent on unknowns like prior art. If you run into prior art you didn't know about, it could gut the value of this patent that you thought was going to be worth a lot of money. So one thing that's very certain about patents is that the value of them is often speculative to begin with, and then is constantly changing as new technologies arise and old technologies go away and more information comes into the picture. So it's continuously varying. So one thing I want to point out is that there's a great reluctance, of course, of folks to abandon patents because you've sunk a lot of money into them. But it's quite expected that a lot of these speculative bets that we have to make in order to file patents, because we're talking about the future here, are going to go bad, and it should not be taken as an indication of failure simply because one of these patents turns out to be not worth very much. Next slide, please. So, what's at a high level, what's the value of proactively managing a portfolio? We experience a lot of different approaches to this by observing our clients, and we also generate our own management processes for managing portfolios. But what we could say is that we think the clients that have had a lot of success, and this isn't all the clients, but the ones that do this have been successful. There's many ways to be successful in managing a portfolio, and we certainly don't want to imply that we've got the answers today. We just have different approaches we want to talk about. But when you pre-target a portfolio, when you're actively targeting a portfolio, and that targeting could be just making sure that the claims actually read on your own products, the claims read on competitors. There's a feedback loop that the best approaches give you, which is constantly looking for the extra information you didn't have to begin with and adjusting your approach. And during prosecution, that means constantly trying to figure out, okay, am I still on the right path? Has the technology already moved a little bit? Do I need to move my claims? What can I do? So this constant targeting is really good, because when you really need to have the patent to go do something with it, you're ready to go, and you're not telling management it's going to take weeks to figure out where you're at. And then of course, equally as important really is getting rid of the chaff with the wheat, and just keeping the wheat, because the more bad disclosures, the more bad patents, and I say bad, I just mean ones that have turned out to be not as valuable as you hope for, the more you can get rid of those as you go, the less there is to obscure your high value assets, and also just save a lot of money. So go to the next slide. So I think, what we're going to really learn today, each panelist is going to give their best practices in a second here. We're going to talk about analytics at the end, and all these approaches we're talking about are kind of methodologies and analytics built into them. But analytics are not a magic bullet. Anyone that's ever used them knows that the exceptions to the rules that you're trying to apply are sometimes swallow the rules. So there's no one-size-fit-all approach to managing a portfolio or analyzing a patent or running analytics. We found that simple approaches often work better than complicated ones. It's really easy to get to try to devise a complex way to manage a portfolio, and it becomes overwhelmingly and just spins out of control. I mean, at the end of the day, eyeballs on review is the ultimate tool. No substitute for reading the claims and reading them on a product. And so that is, everyone knows that if they've done this a lot. And so we're going to talk today about some of the approaches that are time tested that our panelists have done. And, I guess I'll just finish off my part here is to say that, it's just hard work to do this. This isn't like easy, and it's a lot of work, and it has to be repeated over and over again because times keep changing. And then finally, it is a lot like tending a garden. I mean, you can weed the thing to your, and it could be have zero weeds in it, and 2 weeks later, you've got weeds coming out of your ears. And so a lot of portfolio management is like that. You've got to just constantly be in there pulling out the weeds and not pulling out the flowers, because sometimes the weeds, flowers look like weeds. And so hopefully today we'll learn a little bit about how to do that. So with that, we'll turn over to our first panelist, and Tyler Nasidlak. And Tyler's just kind of go through some of the approaches that he's used and share his wisdom. And there is a little emphasis today on trying to get rid of patents that are costing money that could save budget. So hopefully we'll be able to address that. So go ahead, Tyler.
Thanks, Steve, and welcome everyone to the webinar. I hope everyone's staying healthy as well. So I had just a few best practices I thought I would share, and there's certainly a lot of different best practices, and they can vary by size of the organization and size of the portfolio. One of the things that's sort of overarching, but I think is really important as you're looking at how to implement any best practices to involve a cross-functional team. Traditionally, legal works with R&D to build a patent portfolio, and R&D certainly is extremely helpful in that regard. But I think it's also really important to get marketing and finance and other functional groups involved. They can certainly help with, developing a strategy. You'll get better buy-in across the business, and you'll get better engagement across the business. So I think that's hugely beneficial. There's, within that, sort of working with a team like that, it really can depend on the size of the organization, the size of the portfolio, how often you meet, and how regular the meetings are with a team like that. For larger companies, it's good to have a committee with designated individuals, and with smaller companies that can be a little more dynamic, or maybe move a little more quickly. You could have smaller, less formal type meetings. That group led by legal, what I've seen work really well is setting filing targets, setting goals, working with R&D to make sure you've got patent coverage for projects. And if you look at this, sort of have a best practice to prepare strategies yearly that match up with R&D objectives. You can see if your a particular R&D project may have a heavy amount of patenting or may have a smaller amount of patenting, and you can sort of incentivize your R&D group to develop or capture innovation that matches up with their goals. The other aspect that this team can help with, and I'll talk, this slide is a little more geared toward pruning, but setting targets for pruning your portfolio or keeping patents in your portfolio, and matching up those activities with the various stages of a patent's life. So what I've seen work well in practice, especially with larger portfolios, although I think this can also accommodate smaller portfolios as well, is having a strategy that you've presented to the business where you say, hey, we're filing, let's say 100 applications a year, for example. We're going to file 50% of those as PCTs, and then we're going to look at national stage, and we'll keep 50% of those at national stage, and then we'll cut back at, say, the 8th year or the 12th year, and prune our portfolio in a really deliberate manner as it ages. So that could involve a steering team or legal working with the cross-functional folks to each year look at patents that are coming up for a PCT filing and picking the top 50% or 30%, whatever makes sense for the business. And that'll sort of force the business and the different functions to analyze the patents and make sure you're keeping the ones that makes the most sense. Steve mentioned it's, filing a patent is sort of like making a bet. And I always thought about your international protection or even your US protection as sort of you're buying options. So when you file a PCT application, you're buying an option for another 18 months to decide where you're going to file after that. So that's a few things that a cross-functional team can help with, and different practices that they can do to help you manage a portfolio. Another thing to consider is mapping claim coverage of your products and competitor products to your portfolio. We're going to talk a little bit about tagging portfolio, so I'm not going to spend too much time on this bullet here, but there's some really nice tools that you can use to look at your portfolio or subsets within your portfolio and identify target products, competitive products, or your own products that are covered by patents. And doing this can also, facilitate your ability to, understand which patents you want to file continuations on, which ones you want to pursue outside of the US, because you'll have a better idea as the market develops, which of your patents are the most important as they concern your products. Finally, the last few bullet points here really get to pruning, and I think it makes a lot of sense to prune your portfolio deliberately. The one thing that's not mentioned here that really goes without saying is patents that aren't in line with your business objectives, whether the technologies become obsolete or the market just never developed. Those you really should consider dropping. In some cases, you may have an out licensing group if a technology still has value but doesn't match with your core business, you can work with an out licensing group to see if a patent has value to perhaps somebody else. Lots of times, if you don't have an out licensing group, that doesn't really make a lot of sense because it just takes too much time for somebody inside that's dealing with business, core business objectives to really look outside. With OUS patents or outside of the US patents, so there's a lot of considerations that I take into account as I'm deciding how to prune a portfolio. And one thing I'd recommend you do is follow the sales revenue. Lots of times you'll see that that certain countries are going to have much higher sales revenue than others. Those make the most sense for you to keep a patent in. Where you get some wild cards come into play is with manufacturing sites or shipping and distribution lanes or where R&D activity is. If you have countries like that where there's really not a lot of sales revenue, but perhaps there's a competitive activity, you may consider keeping a patent there. I generally follow the sales revenue because people can move manufacturing or move R&D a little more easily, but they can't change the sales in a market. But that's something to keep in mind as you consider pruning or keeping patents that are getting older. Looking at the enforcement in a particular jurisdiction. So there's, the US, Germany, Netherlands, they all have pretty well developed patent enforcement regimes. I mean, it's using the courts is relatively predictable, I'll say. But some areas and some jurisdictions just are a little more difficult. And so keeping that in mind as you're deciding whether to keep a patent or not makes sense. I think it also makes sense for companies that are US based to think about whether they're really going to enforce patents in particular areas, how difficult it might be to manage that. I've had a chance to manage litigation over in Singapore. It's difficult to do from the US. You're typically on meetings at night, and you're not really able to interact with them real time while they do their work during the day, their time. So it's difficult to manage cases like that. And that's just another factor to keep in mind as you decide whether to keep or drop a patent in your portfolio. And then the final thing I'll mention is age of the patent, and just asking yourself as a patent, in the US, once you pay your 12th year maintenance fee, you don't have to worry about payments. But outside of the US, you'll have annuities, and I'll just use Germany as an example. Those annuities can range from $1,500 to $2,000 per year in the last few years of life of the patent. And if your organization really doesn't have the wherewithal, or there's not a competitive product on the market, you don't have interest in enforcing it, it may not be worth keeping a patent like that. And then the final thing I'll say, and just to keep in mind as you're looking at pruning a portfolio, and finance can have a lot of value, but it's always good to keep them in the loop when you're doing activity like this. Patents are an amortized asset. So when you write them or when you prune them or let one go, you'll have a write-off associated with that. And just, if the patent if it's a younger patent and has more life left, that write-off can be, relatively substantial for that patent. So keep that in mind as you're moving through these decisions. That's really all I had. I'll jump in other spots, but you can advance the slide now.
Hey, Tyler, there was one question I think you could address while you're.
Yeah.
There was a question about how you get buy-in from other other parts of the business where you're kind of making them, take away time from their normal function and look at patents for review. Any ideas there?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. It's one of, the patents can really affect every aspect of the business. So lots of times it makes sense. What I would do is sit down with the more senior executives in each area and sort of walk through, hey, this is why marketing is really important and why it would help me or the legal group make a decision. It'd be really helpful if we understand what the markets look like, what they look like international, in the US, what products are advancing and more important, and do the same with the finance group. R&D is generally pretty involved, but the more you can engage with, upper management and make sure they understand why you'd like to do stuff, they can help influence their organization and help with getting the right people involved for you to work with their functional groups. It's a good question.
Thank you, Tyler. I guess we'll move on then, and Tom Marlowe, give us his thoughts.
Sure. Yeah, and those are great points, Tyler. Thanks for sharing those. The first one that I'm going to touch on relates to one that Tyler just mentioned, and this is tagging and classifying your portfolio, key being as you go. As much as we would all like to rely on the US or CPC classification systems that are applied by patent offices, most of the time these really fall short of providing the details needed for any real or useful analysis. And for anyone that's been involved in portfolio classification projects, you know that applying an internally created classification to a portfolio can be extremely time-taking, and it's really easy to get partway through and start second-guessing earlier decisions. And I love the idea of mapping a portfolio and mapping patents to products. I generally like to make this happen by using a technology-first driven classification system. So mapping the patents to, or tagging the patents with within a technology-based classification, and then you go and work with the product lines to tag the products similarly with that technical classification system. And what you end up at the end of the day with is this mapping that's very flexible. So with the technology sitting in the middle and the patents on one side and the products on the other. So you kind of get a one-to-many and many-to-one type of mapping that tends to be sometimes more flexible than directly mapping to products, which can be difficult and a lot of times can require going back and reworking things. But past that, the best thing to do with these classification systems is to work it into your routine processes. So that is when you're doing invention review, say prior to drafting, add the tag or the classification. Maybe pre-grant review is a good time to do it as well, or a good time to relook at it. If done this way, the effort is minimal and the value is created throughout the portfolio, and it tends to be very, very useful. Okay, the second item that I have here is to focus on easy decisions. For most of us, time being a pretty limited resource, the best bang for your buck, or I suppose in this case for your hour, is by scouting the low-hanging fruit first and working towards the more complex as time permits. Low-hanging fruit in this case means matters that are not worth reviewing. So if there's no approaching costs, why waste the time even dealing with them, if there's not going to be dollars on the table? Set them aside, focus on the ones that are worth spending the time on. And then the ones worth spending the time on, start with the obviously low value and the obviously high value. So how do you determine those? And the best methods that I've found are to stack analytics. So take a look for long claims, low citations, unimportant market, unused technologies. Stack them up. The ones that check the most boxes are probably the low value and are probably the ones that you'll be able to look at and quickly determine are low value, may be worth pruning. Then stack some analytics on the high value, which ones are being enforced, which ones have been licensed, which ones are in key markets, which ones are in key technology areas. Stack those up. The ones that check the most boxes are probably going to be the ones that you can quickly put into that high value box. Don't touch them. Keep the investment going on those. This type of a process reduces your data set immediately as far as what you need to dig further into, and saves a ton of time. Maybe after going through those low values, you've already identified enough to get you within the budget range that you want to work with. Okay, and finally, the last one that I have here is understanding your business. Like any legal work, really, patent analysis can't be done in a vacuum. Knowledge of your business is critical to any value determination. And we're not just talking about today's business, but projections and plans reaching out several years. Without this knowledge, trying to place value on a patent or a group of patents is really pointless. Now, I realize this isn't exactly an analysis technique, but I guess the way I like to look at it is understanding your business is like the prep work in painting. Without the sanding and the priming, that paint won't stick. So this seems pretty obvious, but it's one that is far too often taken for granted. And by laying that groundwork, the analysis that you end up doing is going to provide the most value.
Say, Tom, we have a question elaborating, if you could elaborate a little bit on tagging and classifying. And I know Janelle's going to talk a little bit about her approach. And then also a question about what tools can be used for that. And I guess before you take a run at that, I would just like just comment that we've done a lot of this, and Tom and I have even done some of it together. And the tagging and classification, if you get too complicated, can really spin out of control in a hurry due to the fact that every patent is by definition, different than the last. So it gets harder to classify if you're trying to do it sort of create your own system. But go ahead, Tom.
Yeah, I guess I can think of a really good example right along those lines. I remember working on a project where a consulting firm had been brought in and had done an extensive and expensive classification project on a portfolio of about several thousand, right? And this classification had like 4 levels of hierarchy, probably 50 categories at the top level alone. And it was very impressive and substantial. But when it was done, it was extremely difficult to continue to use because it was hard for anyone in the company to figure out exactly where something should get placed as they tried to place it in this comprehensive classification system. And unfortunately, at the end of the day, we ended up scrapping most of it, picking maybe the 20 most used categories and applying those. And that's what ended up being used. And that was something that was able to be maintained between the legal department and the product lines and R&D. And at the end of the day, something that is, I guess, simple enough to be usable, but has enough detail that you aren't putting everything just in one bucket is really what you want to shoot for. So like you said, don't overcomplicate things or else it's not going to be useful at the end of the day.
Hey, Tom, this is Tyler. I mean, I couldn't agree with you more. If you get too complicated, it's really difficult to do and really difficult to report to other aspects of the business. In a simplistic way, you can think about it as maybe You could map each patent or invention to a technology and a use, or a market and a technology. But I would keep those buckets relatively small, and that way, and just make sure they match up with how your business likes information reported, or matches up with sort of how the business functions.
Yeah, and this is Mark jumping in as well. Think about maybe using more than one taxonomy for, for purpose. So if you're going to target some group of competitors, have a taxonomy that targets, this set of patents is for target A and target B. So consider having more taxonomies, but simpler ones.
What I have used successfully is a taxonomy that is not agnostic, but is tailored to the way the client does business. And that eliminates a lot of the extra subcategories that would be necessary in an agnostic system.
Well, Janelle, why don't you just take it from there, and we'll move over to you. Thanks, Tom. That was good.
Yep. How I've done it successfully is to categorize the tech area and product identifier in terms of the organization of the particular company with a portfolio of interest. Tech area would be business unit. The product identifier, certainly at the stage of development, would typically refer to the projects that they have given that product workforce, or that product inventor group, so that when we have to go back and ask for updates to the particular business units or particular inventors, we're speaking their language, and it doesn't become a complicated task of trying to interpret our tags. So as mentioned previously by Tyler and Tom, the tag, we use a tag for each disclosure, and then that tag is updated as necessary during each stage of the application process. And it should be pretty fixed by the time we're at patent issuance and post-issuance payment of fees. So the tag, what we use are alphanumeric letters, and they refer to codes, and then those codes refer to a key, and then in reports, the key identifies each part of the code. So the tag includes the tech area or business unit, the product identifier, such as Project Mosaic or whatever the product group is. The overall importance that we give it a score, that certainly changes over the course of prosecution and issuance. Countries of interest, and what we have found that companies typically have certain criteria for countries, so we can put an alphanumeric character within the tag to identify the country set of interest. Certain product lines are going to be filed in certain countries and not others. So, and that can be broken down into a single number and then reformulated for a report. License obligations is one thing that can fall through the cracks, and we try to take care of it in the tag because it can be very important. This includes not only licenses between companies, but also licenses that the company may have to negotiate with inventors, especially if they're German inventors and perhaps Japanese and Chinese inventors as well. Germany has very strict requirements regarding royalty payments to inventors, and the agreement between the company and the inventor must be negotiated at the time of filing, or at least ideally, and then certain things must be done prior to issuance of the patent, and sometimes even post-patent, depending upon the nature of the license agreement. So we star in our identifier, our tag, those cases where we have especially German inventors, but perhaps other country inventors that have these same obligations, so that when you're looking at dropping a case or even reassigning it, that is immediately highlighted, because otherwise it can get lost in the shuffle pretty quickly with consequences that are highly undesirable. So the tags are created at the time of initial filing, usually, but not necessarily, a provisional, and then are reviewed at the time of PCT filing, national stage filing, the paying of issue fees, and then maintenance fees. The tags allow a portfolio manager to parse the portfolio by tech area, business unit, product identifier, the special licenses, and overall importance, which will change over time. So patents and patent applications of interest can be sent to business units periodically to determine whether the tag is accurate. And when they're sent, they can be sent in a report identifying this group in a category that that business unit understands, because that's the tag that they gave it initially. Users of a tagging system can then quickly identify the value of a patent if the tag is associated with a revenue or profit database by product. Ideally, you're actually dealing with a revenue database, but sometimes that's not possible. And in that case, then you go back to the business unit and talk to the individual or group that can attach revenues and profit streams to products, and that can help to determine the value of that particular patent. So the tagging system, combined with ideally a revenue profit database, allows a user to identify the most valuable patents, patents that may be sold or abandoned, and patents with ongoing licensing obligations. Thanks very much for your time.
Thank you, Janelle. There was a question came in, and I'd like a comment, I guess, from all the panelists, if they've got one, is, so once you've decided which patents are high value, low value, who should make the final determination? The business unit or the patent department, or is it collaboration? What kind of a process was used at various panelist companies they worked at?
Yep.
This is Tyler. I would say that I in my experience, I really haven't. It's usually collaborative, and there's usually agreement on which patents get kept and which get dropped. I haven't really seen, in doing this a number of times, where there's like a real sticking point. Typically, if there's something that falls into that category, you end up keeping it. And then lots of times it really depends. It somewhat depends on whose budget the spending falls in. Most of the time, legal will have their own budget for patent activity, and then usually the decision whether to keep something or abandon it after a group or business team makes a recommendation, typically would be with legal in that case, in my experience.
Did you have something you wanted to say there? We accidentally cut you off.
My experience is also that it's collaborative between the patent group and the business unit.
Very good. Any other comments from the panelists?
Yeah, Mark here. So in my experience, it has really been, bifurcated. If it's the business group that has the budget pays for these various units, a lot of times they will have final say. But in general, if the legal department has a core budget, they can override and pull those into their budget, even if the business unit doesn't want to do it, because again, it's not it's a long-term decision, and sometimes business units will throw the baby out with the bathwater. So always a good thing to have the legal department weigh in.
So Mark, why don't we segue to your slide?
Great.
And I just want to give a little update. Keep in mind time, we're about 12:39 or so, 12:40. Hopefully you can get through your slides, and then we can get to the analytics pieces pretty quickly. leave a
Great.
few minutes left for questions. We'll take questions as we go, but we keep it rolling. Thanks.
I'll do my best. So again, I will echo that everything the other panelists have said is, I think quite uniformly good practices. Again, tagging is absolutely essential. I'm a fan of small sets of tags, built for purpose sets of tags. So business fit includes things like, is it part of your long-term business? Is it part of your taxation model? Are you using your patents to move assets and revenue around the globe for tax purposes? Is there a macro or micro view of this? Because sometimes you'll throw away a key patent in a portfolio, where a key patent will collapse in your portfolio that will take your entire assertion strategy out of whack. Revenue is always pretty straightforward. What I try to do when I'm working with clients to, work through a culling or a keeping exercise is I try to matrix it out in a way that, is logical and obvious. Standards, if you're part of a standards body, don't throw away essential patents. Encumbrances is also a area. There can't tell you the number of times I've found patents that are still in the name of a company entity that has ceased to exist. Formerly at Thompson, we had many, many hundreds of entities, and the patents were owned all over the place. So it is a less than fun activity to bring all those patents into the correct set of ownership. It's heavily expensive. So as you're going through your culling, make sure that the administrative details of your patents are known or in some place that you can easily reach them and move them around. Other limits would include things like, has this patent been litigated on, or has it been opposed on? One of the questions asked is as a triaging aspect, is an opposition in the EU a valid item? Absolutely. The whole point here is to put as objectively as possible how these patents fit into your world or your client's world as you're putting it forth. I also like to think about a matrix in the series. Who are you going to target with these portfolios? One thing that I've always said about patents is patents are personal. What you assert against one target may have absolutely no relevance in asserting against another target. So having a good taxonomy of who you would be enforcing this against is, I think, absolutely crucial and critical. And Steve, if we want to move to the next slide, I can just talk about kind of the speed dating side of analytics. If I'm forced into doing analytics in a hurry and tell me find bad patents in a hurry, these are the kind of some of the criteria I work from. If something's had more than 6 office actions in the U.S. PTO, it's immediately a suspect patent in my world. We have to go back and look at it. But 6+ office actions, 2+ RCEs, lack of any citation by an examiner. Citation, I find, is a very tricky place to spend a lot of time. It's just a checkbox. But lack of citation in the last 5 years. Nobody's interested. Nobody's even very interested at all. No family members. It was a one and done application. The inventor has departed from the company. This is especially critical when you've got, small businesses or smaller organizations where, your key person is gone. So it's a complementary factor, but I think it's also another good sign. And then finally, if you're doing, extensive looks at file histories, if your claim length was, many words longer than your initial file claim length, another key indicator for a bad patent. Move to the next slide. Now the good stuff. Now revenue generation or has been used in litigation is a key reason to keep something. If it's got something making money, the argument is the money brought in is that any better? Is it more than the money going out the door to keep this in line? Now, one of the things I find is really useful these days is a 102, 103 reference where it's come up against a competitor. So that to me is probably the best quantitative reference of a good patent or a patent you should look more closely at. Also, using machine tools, finding semantically similar claims to known good patents, some that have been used in an opposition or in litigation. You can use a clustering algorithm for that, but it requires the human actually read the patent. Another proxy is, claim to have unique words under 40. Also, did the company spend a lot of money on it? That can be a red herring because sometimes companies are misguided and they spend a lot of money for it and they do extensive family and continuation practice and something that's going to go nowhere. But if you're doing stuff in a hurry, definitely look at that as a contributing factor. And we can move on to the next slide here. Steve, is this yours?
Yeah, it is. And actually, we got a couple of questions I think we can tackle. We've got time. One of them for the panelists is, what's typical reporting structure in most companies in terms of whether the patent counsel reports into the CTO or to the CEO or to the CFO. Anybody have any observations on that?
I can say I've seen both. A lot of times you've got the IP function under the chief legal officer or the general counsel, who then reports to the CEO. Generally, you have that chief patent counsel going directly to the CEO, and more mature businesses with more senior IP counsel, where IP has become kind of a central or more ingrained part of the business. To the CTO, that tends to be more, earlier stage tech focused companies. But, I've also seen IP or legal in general under the CFO, especially where there's kind of more of a licensing angle or where the IP function serves as a P&L. That can happen as well.
So I want to go back to Mark's slide that he talked about the unique claim word factor there. Mark, can you elaborate on that?
Sure. When claims by definition, the shorter the claim in general, the broader the coverage of that claim. So in looking at claims in hundreds and thousands of patents, if you find a claim that is under 40 words, 40 unique words, excluding the words like the and a and that sort of stuff, I found it's a good place to start looking for a broader coverage. Now, it's not always true, but it's some place where you can start, by saying, well, if you're under 40 words, you've got, a relatively broad concept that you've captured in that claim. If you're at 400 words, forget about it. I mean, it's very hard to get a highly defined, broad scoped, impossible to design on claim, I think, if you're over 400 words.
So Mark, just a quick, I think maybe the unique words is the trigger there that maybe the question. So, unique, you just mean they're not connector words or? Yeah,
they're not stop words. They're words that are not, connector words, the, and, if, but. So unique nouns and unique verbs.
All right. I think that maybe answered the question.
Okay, sorry.
And then I'll save this last question to the end. So let's move ahead. And I think Tom, one more on while that slide. We're talking about using 102, 103 citations.
Sure.
Mark, and you maybe just elaborate on that for a second.
Yeah, so the 102 and 103 aspect is a fairly recent development in analytic tool sets. A number of companies provide them. But if you're looking at forward rejection data and that your patent has caused a forward rejection in a particular competitor, and you can go and say, was it a 102? Was it a complete reference? It's a good indicator that patent might have some further legs. And if you've got an open family member on it, it would be also a patent to consider filing continuation on. Same thing with the 103, but less so, because you didn't quite hit the nail on the head, so to speak. So this is a good way of looking at how personal your patent portfolio is against a particular competitor or a particular market player that you want to build your portfolio in light of.
Thanks, Mark. We'll kind of move on and gallop to the end. So this is just a little trick that we learned over the years. looking for important patents. And one thing that anyone's noticed, they've done a lot of looking through large portfolios to find important patents, is that for any given technology, there's a kind of a T0, I'll call it a time zero in the timeline when the technology is first introduced and makes its way into the, into the literature, or makes its way into the market. And most of your important patents all fall within a couple of years of that introduction of that technology. So, if you're going to look for the best patents, one way to get there is to figure out, when that time frame is that you need to look in. And another thing is that often find ways to find important patents, even in your own portfolio, is by finding a patent that looks relevant to your product today, and then doing forward and backward citation searches or charts, and then building a pool up around that. And that helps you find patents that are not maybe using conventional terminology, because you're kind of using the examiner's citation of those early references against subsequent patents to, sort of like a breadcrumb trail back to the beginning. That's been very successful. And then on the flip side, you can kind of figure, okay, look, this patent covers X, Y, Z. This technology has been around for a long time. This is not an important new advance in the art. Odds of that patent having any kind of breadth that is going to give you value is extremely low. Exceptions are, you might have copycat competitors, and so even a picture claim on your product may have some value. So as I said to start this out, there's a bazillion exceptions to every rule. And let's move on to the next slide.
Yeah, so I'll talk about this one. Citation analysis can be useful as a starting point. And, I will admit citation analysis does get criticism for its limitations, but, at the end of the day, any analytics are fine as long as you appreciate them for what they are and what they are not. Citation analysis used right as a proxy for like a value in the market. What we're trying to do is get an understanding of how important a patent may be based on how it's referenced by others. If competitors are citing a patent, or say it comes up in an examination which puts it on the citation list, this is an indicator that what is protected is relevant, at least, to some technology that someone else believes is worth spending money on to get the patent protection. So the more that this happens, and the more companies that are citing your patent, and the more that those are competitors, the more valuable your patent may be. And the key here is that word may. This is just an indicator. So you use this type of analysis to group patents for additional analysis. Analytics like this are common in many tools, and maybe that's actually a good transition into the next slide. I think we talk about.
Hey, Tom, one thing that, actually this is a different slide, but
okay.
That didn't make it on any of our slides, but I've seen it used and pretty effectively, is in some circumstances, inventor analytics can be pretty interesting, especially looking at where inventors have gone to from your company, because many times they take the same ideas that they were using in the company they were at first, and they kind of reinvent them, if you will, in the next company. And so I've seen that used as a way to sort of identify potential patents that you may want to keep around, just in case the inventor that left starts reinventing in the same area or does something subsidiary. So the next slide is just something that the firm has developed in order to, a lot of times when we're prosecuting cases, we're asked to do terminal disclaimers, and many times it's not immediately apparent in the heat of the moment, what that terminal disclaimer is going to do to your term of your patent, and you may be tempted to just go ahead and put it in when actually maybe you should fight it because it's going to really shorten the term. The flip side of that is that there's a lot of times you get a US patent, it may have a 12-year annuity payment. It may look like it's got quite a bit of extension on it from patent term, extension, but in fact, you've disclaimed it all. So being able to quickly determine what the actual term of the patent is automatically can be pretty helpful to save big payments, at the tail end of US patents. And so we mentioned that as something that we can do if anybody's interested. And there was a question that I saved to the end here, which I think is a really good question, is there's a couple of good ones in here. Let's dive into this first one. We got about 5 minutes left, which is, when do you start using these tools, to classify or tagging portfolios? I mean, how big does a portfolio have to be before this starts to make sense? Because clearly, if you've got 100 patents, you can rifle through those in a pretty limited period of time or short period of time. Anybody have any answers to that question?
Hey, Steve, this is Mark here. I think 100 is about the upper limit of what people can rifle through and keep under their belt, especially if you're looking at, families that have, slightly different claims. So I think a rule of thumb, if you've got 100 more patents, unique patents, not, many family members, I think that's a good place where you really need to start putting, good behavioral tagging in place to understand what you've got in there.
Okay.
And I would say it's also not a bad practice to start tagging like from patent number 5. You might as well start getting some categorization going. It's going to be driven by your business anyway. So as the portfolio develops, you can always develop that taxonomy, but you can't start that practice too early.
So another question actually that came up is using examiner patent acceptance rates to identify patents value. Any thoughts on that?
I think that's a bad idea, although it may depend upon the art unit. I mean, there are examiners who never allow cases and examiners who never reject cases. I don't think that's a good analytic.
Yeah, I think it's a very very subjective way of thinking about a patent, because if you have an examiner who allows your patent and he doesn't allow many others, or she doesn't allow many others, it may be just the day. I mean, there's so much diversity in examiner behaviors that I don't think I could rely upon it as a good proxy.
Okay, so there was one more question, which was kind of an interesting question too, which is, how could non-patent literature perhaps be used as some kind of citation analysis? Have we ever done anything like that?
Well, I can certainly say that we've not used it for citation analysis, and non-patent literature always is useful in prior art analysis. Mm-hmm. NPL is always cited in patents, and we certainly could extract that out. But you would have to, find a cross-reference between the citation itself and some other factor, whether it's the inventor, the disclosure, to make it useful. I mean, it certainly would be useful as long as you can extract facts, data, people, times, and events out of it.
I think if it's cited in reverse, if your patent got cited in some non-patent literature as a reference, it might tell you that whoever wrote the article, if it was a competitor or something that published something that would be helpful. But in reverse, it's interesting to think about. Yeah, and by the way, somebody did ask whether the slides are available. They will be available to be downloaded. They'll be emailed out even, I think, but they're certainly available. And we've got our last slide, and I figure we should maybe just rifle through this and then wrap it up.
Sure, I'll jump on this one. I mean, this is just kind of a cumulative list of various tools that are available to work with here. A number of these are free, a number of them are commercial. I know we have a lot of people from the various commercial tools on the call here. Hi, everyone. I'm not going to go on record here as recommending one over the next one. They're all useful. But these are some of the tool sets that we use, in our patent searching, our analytics, our patent drafting. I find each of them has a different, unique usefulness. And I would encourage you to look at them all. And I'll move forward unless there are specific questions.
I think that is, oh, we got one more slide. No,
Yeah.
Okay.
This is my last slide from kind of a personal viewpoint. There has been a lot of discussion whether a machine can replace a machine-assisted review. Look here, these two pictures. One is a pure machine clustering algorithm depiction of semiconductors, and the right hand is actually a claim-by-claim analysis of a set of patents. The one on the left is unexplainable, and the one on the right is something that takes you down right into the claim level and gives you reasons for why there is a breadth of coverage. So it is a personal peeve of mine when people try to tell me that the photo on the left is meaningful for any sort of useful analytics. So I want to leave everybody with a cautionary on that. Thank you.
And with that, I think we have run out of time. I'll just see if there's any last, I think we've pretty much answered all the open question. Well, not quite, but what we can do is we can reach out individually and answer these last couple questions if we've got any. But thanks everybody for joining us today. We hope that we gave you some informative information, and I'll just finish it off by saying that it's definitely a very challenging thing, and to understand your portfolio because of how it keeps changing and so much information, hard to get. But hopefully you can all use this slide to help, or the information we gave you to help you out. So thanks everybody for attending, and that'll be it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Michelle, did you want to mention anything about our next upcoming webinars before we turn this off?
Sure, thank you, Steve.
Yeah.
The next episode of the Patent Analytics webinar series will be on Thursday, April 30th at noon Central Time. It will cover using patent landscapes to develop IP-rich products and valuable patent positions. Please join us again and be well. And registrants will automatically be emailed a copy of the webinar and the slides when available. Thank you.
Thank you, Michelle. Bye.